You've done everything you were supposed to do. You show up. You work. You move through the days in the correct order and maintain the right relationships and complete what needs completing. And if you're honest, genuinely honest, not the version you give other people, at the end of a lot of those days, there is a feeling underneath everything that's difficult to name. Not devastation, not depression necessarily. Something quieter than that. A persistent sense that you're going through the right motions without quite being there. Performing a life rather than living one. If that resonates at all, this video is about the person who understood that feeling most precisely. Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist in Vienna. In 1942, he was arrested. He spent 3 years in 4 Nazi concentration camps, Auschwitz among them. He lost his parents, his brother, and his wife. He arrived at Auschwitz with the only manuscript of his first book, which was taken from him on the first day. And in those 3 years, under conditions of total external deprivation, he observed something that contradicted what every major psychological theory of his era predicted. He found that the prisoners who survived longest, not physically, but inwardly, were not the ones with the most hope of rescue. They were the ones who had found something that gave the suffering meaning, not made the suffering tolerable, gave it meaning. That claim is either the most important distinction in 20th century psychology, or a dangerous platitude. By the end of this video, you'll have the full argument and can decide which. We'll examine 3 things: how Frankl found this answer, and why the circumstances matter. The core claim of logotherapy, what it actually says, not the summary version, and what it changes about a life that, from the outside, already looks right. There's one part of Frankl's argument that most summaries leave out entirely. It's the part that matters most. I'll come back to it. The man in the worst circumstances. By the end of this chapter, you'll understand exactly why Frankl's answer carries a weight that armchair philosophy cannot, because it was found in Auschwitz. There's one detail about where Frankl developed this framework that changes how seriously you can take it. Not because suffering confers authority, it doesn't, but because it closes a specific escape route that most objections rely on. Viktor Frankl was born in Vienna in 1905. By his mid-30s, he was one of the most respected psychiatrists in Austria. A colleague who had met both Freud and Adler, learned from both, and developed serious disagreements with both. Freud's model held that human beings are primarily driven by the pleasure principle, the avoidance of pain, the pursuit of satisfaction. Adler's model held that the primary drive was the will to power, status, assertion, the desire to overcome inferiority. Frankl's developing view was that both frameworks missed something central. The primary human motivation, he argued, was not pleasure or power. It was the will to meaning, the desire not to feel good or to feel superior, but to feel that one's existence was not arbitrary. This was not, in 1940, a clinically proven framework. It was a position developed from his practice and his reading of the existentialist tradition, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, the existential phenomenologists. He had been treating patients in Vienna who had every material comfort and no diagnosable disorder, and who were suffering from what he called the existential vacuum, a pervasive sense of emptiness that no therapeutic technique adequately addressed. Then the experiment arrived in a form no ethical researcher could ever design. In September 1942, Frankl was deported to Theresienstadt. In October 1944, to Auschwitz. He arrived carrying the only copy of his manuscript. It was confiscated on entry. He stitched notes on scraps of paper and hid them in his clothing. What he observed over the next 3 years was a natural laboratory, one in which every external condition that psychology assumed to be necessary for psychological health had been stripped away. Safety, relationships, agency, social identity, the future, What remained, and it was not uniform, varied between prisoners in ways that purely materialist psychology could not predict. Some, not all, and Frankl is careful never to romanticize this, found that something held. Not hope for rescue, something deeper than that. A person they were somehow still living for. A piece of work they intended to complete. A specific refusal to surrender the last thing that could not be physically taken. And Frankl's observation, made from inside those conditions, not from a library, was that this was not incidental. It was the variable that mattered most to what he would later call the inner life. He walked out of the camps in April 1945. He was 37 years old. His parents were dead. His brother was dead. His wife, Tilly, had died in Bergen-Belsen. He had lost almost everything the meaning of his pre-war life had organized itself around. And he sat down and wrote Man's Search for Meaning in 9 days. The point is not that suffering is good, or that what happened was anything other than what it was. The point is that the theory was not developed in comfort. It was tested against the worst conditions any of his future patients would ever face. And it did not collapse. That matters for what comes next. By the end of this chapter, you'll understand the core claim of logotherapy, and why it's more demanding than the version most people encounter. The word logotherapy comes from the Greek logos, meaning reason, word. Frankl's framework was built on a single premise. The primary human motivation is the desire for meaning. And when that desire has nowhere to go, when the will to meaning is frustrated, the result is what he called noogenic neurosis. In plain terms, a suffering that no therapeutic technique resolves because it does not arise from psychological disorder. It arises from the absence of meaning. The feeling of emptiness despite doing everything right is not, in Frankl's view, a symptom of illness. It is the natural result of a life organized around goals that cannot carry the weight we have assigned them. Now here is where the theory becomes precise, and where most summaries stop being accurate. Frankl does not say that meaning can be found. He says it is created through engagement. This distinction is not semantic. It changes everything about where to look. The common experience of searching for meaning, sitting down with a journal, writing, "What is my purpose?" trying to locate the passion that should organize everything, produces almost nothing. Not because meaning is unavailable, but because meaning cannot be discovered through introspection. It can only be discovered through response. Frankl identifies 3 categories through which meaning becomes available. The first is through what he calls creative values, what you give to the world through your work. Not the work itself, the quality of your engagement with it. A physician who brings full attention to a patient they will never remember is creating something. A person completing a task no one will notice is creating something. The meaning is in the engagement, not in the outcome or the recognition. The second is through experiential values, what you receive from the world, and most specifically through love. Frankl's claim is that genuinely loving someone, not being loved in return, but actively loving, is itself a source of meaning that does not depend on outcome. The experience of genuine regard for another person generates meaning, regardless of whether it is reciprocated or sustained. The third source is attitudinal values, and this is where the argument becomes genuinely difficult. Attitudinal values refer to the stance you take toward unavoidable suffering, not suffering you chose or can escape. The specific category of difficulty that is not going to change, the illness, the loss, the circumstance that is simply the reality of your life. Frankl's claim, and this should give you pause, is that even in those circumstances, something remains within human control. Not the feeling, not the outcome, the attitude. And here is where Frankl goes further than most people are comfortable with. Because this is not, as it is most often read, a coping mechanism. A coping mechanism manages suffering. It makes the suffering more bearable. What Frankl is claiming is something more radical, that the chosen attitude toward unavoidable suffering, the last freedom that no external force can remove, is itself a form of meaning creation. Everything can be taken from a man, he writes, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. That is not optimism. It is not positive thinking. It is an extremely demanding philosophical claim about what it means to be human. By the end of this chapter, you'll have heard the strongest case against Frankl's framework, and seen exactly where it holds and where it doesn't. The first objection is obvious. Easy for Frankl to say, he was the one who survived. This deserves a serious answer. Frankl did survive. Many prisoners who had, by his account, found sources of meaning did not survive. He never claims otherwise. His argument is not that meaning guarantees survival. What he argues is that the inner life, the quality of a person's experience and the coherence of their self within that experience, was shaped by whether they found meaning. Survival was a matter of conditions he could not control. Inner life was not. The objection assumes the theory is about outcomes. It isn't. The second objection is philosophically sharper. Isn't this just reframing? Calling suffering meaningful doesn't change the suffering. Frankl anticipates this. His answer: there is a genuine difference between a pain that has no place in your account of your life and a pain that you understand as connected to something that mattered. Not a comfortable difference. A structural one. Suffering that is simply random, that happens to you and means nothing about anything, occupies a different place in a person's experience than suffering that is understood as the cost of a love that was real, or a commitment that held. The pain is identical, the meaning is not. And Frankl's clinical observation, supported by research conducted after his death in fields ranging from grief psychology to Viktor Frankl's own post-war clinical practice, is that this difference is measurable in how people navigate loss, illness, and grief. This is not a psychological trick. It is a claim about the structure of human experience. The third objection Frankl takes most seriously, because he watched it happen. What if no meaning is available? What if the conditions are too complete, the deprivation too total? His honest answer: this happens. He is not arguing that meaning is always recoverable. He is arguing that the search for it, the refusal to accept that it is irretrievably gone, is itself an expression of something fundamental in the human being, and that this refusal remains available, at some level, even in the conditions he personally witnessed. That is not a comfortable answer. It is an honest one. Before the close, I want to return to something from the beginning, because it reads differently now, what this changes. By the end of this chapter, you'll understand what Frankl's framework actually changes about an ordinary day, not as a technique, but as a reorientation of attention. The feeling from the beginning, performing a life rather than living one, going through the correct motions without quite being there. Frankl has a precise diagnosis for this. He calls it existential frustration. The will to meaning has been redirected because it has no adequate target into the will to pleasure or the will to power. People pursue comfort, recognition, distraction, status, not because these things are wrong, but because they are available substitutes for the thing that is actually missing. The problem with substitutes is that they cannot satisfy the original hunger. You can accumulate comfort without the emptiness resolving. You can climb the hierarchy without the question disappearing. Because the question was never about comfort or status. It was about whether what you are doing is for something, whether your engagement with your life is connected to anything that matters. Frankl's most practical insight concerns where the search goes wrong. Most people treat meaning as a destination, something to locate, identify, and then organize a life around. A purpose, a calling, a passion that will make the answer clear. The search itself is the problem, because it turns your attention away from present engagement toward an imagined future moment of discovery. The reorientation he offers is a shift in the question, not what is my purpose, but what is this situation asking of me? That question points outward, toward the work in front of you, toward the person in front of you, toward the difficulty you cannot escape and the attitude you can still choose toward it. Meaning does not arise through searching for it. It arises when it arises, in response to what the moment requires. What creative people, caregivers, craftspeople, and soldiers have reported throughout history, without the philosophical framework, is consistent with this. The times of clearest meaning were not the times they were searching for it. They were the times they were fully occupied by something that demanded their complete attention. The Stoic tradition, which predates Frankl by 19 centuries, arrives at a similar conclusion through different reasoning. Epictetus, born into slavery in approximately 50 AD, who owned nothing and controlled nothing except his own judgment, identified the same irreducible freedom Frankl would find in the camps. The capacity to choose one's response to what happens. Two figures with no contact with each other, opposite ends of history, the same discovery. When traditions that had no access to each other arrive at the same conclusion, it is worth pausing over. The final piece. Frankl is clear that meaning cannot be commanded. You cannot decide to feel that your life means something and have the feeling follow. What you can do is choose the quality of your engagement with what is in front of you, and trust that meaning will emerge from that engagement rather than from the search for it. Not a guarantee. A reorientation of where to look. I said I'd return to the beginning. You've done everything you were supposed to do. That remains true. The feeling, performing a life rather than living one, remains a real experience. What Frankl's framework offers is not a cure for it. It is an explanation and a reorientation. The explanation, that feeling is the natural result of a will to meaning with no adequate target. Not a sign that something is wrong with you. A sign that you've been looking for meaning where it cannot be located, in the accomplishment, the recognition, the arrival at some future state that will finally resolve the question. The reorientation, meaning is not found. It arises through engaged attention to what is in front of you, the work, the person, or even the difficulty you cannot escape. The question is not, what is my purpose? The question is, what is this situation asking of me? Viktor Frankl walked out of Auschwitz in April 1945. He was 37 years old. He had lost almost everyone. He sat down and wrote for 9 days, not as therapy, but because there was something he had found under the worst conditions any of his future patients would ever face that needed to be said clearly. Man's Search for Meaning has sold more than 16 million copies. It is not a self-help book. It is an account of what remains when everything else is taken. And what remains, he found, is always at least this: the question of what the moment is asking, and the choice of how you respond to it. A new essay every week. A different question, a different tradition. Subscribe so you're there.